Welcome to the Journal of Biophilic Design podcast. Many thanks for joining us today on the Journal of Biophilic Design. Today's podcast is a really interesting one. As some of the listeners know, that I have a PhD in Greek and Latin, and I've got a fascination with the ancient world and obviously nature. And today we're joined by Dr. Patty Baker to show that scholarship, research and understanding of the importance of biophilic design started well over 2,500 years ago. The Greeks understood the benefits of it. The Romans did as well. They embraced biophilic design in their centers of healing and also in their homes and gardens. Dr. Baker is an archaeologist and academic. She was head of the Department of Classical and Archaeological Studies at the University of Kent. She's currently at the Department of History in Virginia, although she's talking to us from California. So truly international. She gained her PhD in classics in 2000 from Newcastle University. She's also published research on medicine and space, body surroundings and borders in antiquity and the Middle Ages, the archaeology of nature in the Greek and Roman world, published by Cambridge University Press, viewing health, Asclepia in the natural settings. There's so much I want to talk to you about, so much. I'm going to have to get you back to talk on about the Asclepia in the natural setting. So listeners, make sure you bookmark this podcast because it's going to be a good one, this one and the two future ones I'm going to have her on. So, but anyway, today, Patty, thanks so much for joining us. You're here to talk about your research on identifying the connection between Roman perceptions, or conceptions rather, maybe perceptions and conceptions, I don't know, of pure air and physical mental health in the Pompeiian gardens, and it's a multi-sensory approach to ancient medicine. So that's me doing a big old waffle. But thanks so much for joining us, Patty.
Thank you very much for inviting me to speak with you, Ness. It's a fascinating topic, and I'm really excited to talk about it.
Lovely, thanks so much. Well, obviously I've gone on and on and on about what you do, but could you just tell us a little bit about what you're covering right now, please?
Okay, at the moment I'm sort of in a transitional phase where I have one foot in academia and one foot where I'm starting my own business. In academia, I teach Greek and Roman history and Greek and Roman archaeology. My areas of research, as you mentioned, were ancient health, but that sort of moved on to look at health and the environment, and then how, especially the Greeks, but mainly the Romans, how they looked at their understanding of how health was affected by the environment. And there's a lot of literature on this. There's some ancient literature by the Hippocratic writer on airs, waters, places. He talks about how environments affect people's body types and health. But one thing I kept noticing when I was reading this is nobody was explaining how exactly the natural world was affecting people's humoral system or how they understood their health. And I did find one or two quotes that just said it's all through sensory experiences. So basically by being in a healthy environment, you experience it through your senses and that affects your health. So that got me interested, and I started looking at, well, what did they think was a healthy space? And that was, so looking at gardens and other descriptions of healthy spaces. So that's one area of my research. And then, as I said, I have another foot that's outside academia, and I'm very curious about how the Romans made their floral crowns and designs. So I'm developing a small business called Pax in Natura, or Peace in Nature in Latin. And I'm looking at historically inspired floral arrangements that are environmentally friendly. So, and that's more for the general public. So one foot in academia and one foot and outside. So it's very nice.
Well, that's really great. We spoke about this just before you came on air. So I'm going to have to get you back on, and maybe we could do like a live demonstration or something. That'd be really cool. Yeah. That'd be really cool. So that's the thing. That's a date in the diary.
Okay, great.
Can I ask you first of all, like, why the ancient world? What was the fascination for you?
I think it started when I was really young. Actually, I was 8, and I remember just digging in my parents' back garden, and this wasn't the ancient world in particular, but it was. Grew up outside Philadelphia, and just up the street from us, there was a battleground for where they had part of the American Revolution. And my parents lived on this main street that had been there since the 18th century. And when we were digging the garden, we used to find artifacts. So that got me interested in physical history, I guess you could say. I didn't know what archaeology was at the time, but just like, ooh, old stuff. And then this is really cool. So I liked just history and material culture from a very young age. But then when I was about 10, I heard about Pompeii and started seeing books on Pompeii. And I was fascinated because it was about the people in the daily life, and you could see how they actually lived. And that's what really attracted me to the ancient world, was just seeing how people in Pompeii had lived. It came alive for me, and then I started studying Latin in high school. So it all just took off from there. But it was a book on Pompeii and finding artifacts as a child. So
Well, that's really great, because obviously this research that we're going to talk about is about the Pompeian gardens, the gardens in Pompeii, which for people who are listening, most people probably know, but it's a place in Italy near Vesuvius. And obviously when Vesuvius erupted in 79, was it?
yeah,
Yeah,
AD
yeah.
17.
Oh gosh, my brain is actually sort of working. um, obviously it sort of it covered and preserved the city, all the archaeology and the gardens as well, which is really unique. So I'm really looking forward to speaking to you about that. So why was nature so important in the ancient world, do you think?
That's a huge question. We could go on for
Yes.
hours about it. But I think one of the main things was, if we go back to the philosophy, the pre-Socratic philosophers, so these are philosophers just before Socrates, so just early 5th century BC, sort of as a context for that. And what these philosophers are trying to do is they're trying to figure out what the world is made of. They're just trying to figure out how is the world made. And they came up with this theory ultimately by Empedocles, who was this pre-Socratic philosopher who lived in this century. We have his fragments, and he talks about these theories of earth, air, fire, and water. So everything's made of 4 elements. And this idea is just carried through history for a long period. I mean, you see it in the early modern period as well, these 4 elements: earth, air, fire, and water. Everything they describe in the cosmos was made of that. So that's people, the stones, the trees, whatever you see around you, the stars, it's all some form of earth, air, fire, and water. And because we're all made of this, humans as well as animals and plants, then in a way they're sort of seeing themselves as part of nature. So how do you balance yourself as part of, rather than being separate from? The important thing is they're actually part of it. They're made from the same materials, even though the materials may have a different balance. A stone will be more solids as opposed to the sun, which is fire, or something like that. So I think that's really a part of why nature was important. You're a part of it. And then another thing they recognize, not only is it practical, I mean, you get your food from it, you need to drink, the things to survive, but also what I argue is that your health is very much affected by where you are in nature, what kind of environment you're in, and how do you keep yourself balanced within that frame. So I mentioned the work Airs, Waters, Places, and the writer of that it was about a 5th century work, 5th century BC. The writer that talks about how people living in different climatic regions have different body types. So he says the Scythians, for example, a group of people who live in now what's around the Black Sea, what's the Ukraine, that sort of area. He says it's cold, it's damp, so they're sort of pale and flabby, and they're like the climate itself. So he really relates, he or she really relates the people to their environment. So I think they see this connection very much between body type, health, and nature. So I mean, you could argue it in so many different ways, but to me, that's what I think is most fascinating. So
Really cool. And the research paper you sent me identifying the connection between Roman conceptions of pure air and physical and mental health in Pompeian gardens is really fascinating. I mean, it really is. I think I said to you, I woke up at like 3 o'clock in the morning, couldn't sleep. I came downstairs and read it, and I was just ready, like cover to cover, because I was just fascinated. You write really well. It sort of drew me in. I mean, and I think I was really fascinated because as you sort of mentioned the different elements, but you discussed the sort of the multi-sensory approach to ancient medicine. And obviously with biophilic design, we're always talking about the senses, sound, smell, taste, the air around you, the feel on your skin, the air you breathe in. It's all these different elements are so important in biophilic design. And obviously these are things that the Romans were discussing and understood, and in their concept of ancient garden design, if you want. I mean, can you sort of give us a top line really on what you were looking to explore in that paper, really?
The paper really asks a couple of things. Basically, the way it started was I kept coming across these quotes from Roman writers, Pliny the Younger, for example, who lived in the late 1st century AD. He was a lawyer, and he came from a very wealthy family. But he keeps talking about how he needed to escape the city of Rome. It wasn't healthy for him. And he said, so he would go out to his villas, and he had villas in the mountains, 2 in Lake Como, as you do, and then one just on the coast, just outside of Rome. And he keeps saying, I need to go for the pure air. And then I found other writers talking about pure air. And I was saying, well, what do they mean by pure air? And how did they identify it? So that was just the first thing. First of all, what was it and how do they identify it? Just saying it's pure air, well, okay, but what do they think is pure air? And then the second was, then how was it healthy? And I sort of mentioned this before, through the sensory experiences. So the paper looks at how they define pure air and then how they actually saw it working and made them healthy. So that's the tagline for the paper.
Was there following on from that then?
Okay.
Can you sort of distill all your years of like research and sort of and explain what you've come to discover that they meant as the meaning of like pure and clear air?
Okay, so basically the way I think they meant it was that the way they identified it was actually through their senses. So through vision, pure air was clear air, and the way they would identify clear air was through color. So green was a very important color. There's a lot of greenery that I'll explain how it works in the senses in a minute, but I'll just explain how they identified it first. So the color green, which was very good, it was a healthy color. So if you see a lot of green, that was sort of an idea that air was pure. Then clear or sometimes white air, so if you see bright sunlight or there's not a lot of smoke around, so clear air like that would be like one of the colors. And then sometimes blue, different shades of blue. So clear blue sky is a healthy blue, but if you're getting a stormy blue sky, that's a bit different. That's not so healthy. So clear bluish seawater or clear water. So what you see, the colors, and then also movement. If air is moving, slight breezes, then it's healthy. You don't want it still and stagnant. And then through scent, good scent is actually no scent, very, very mild scents. And actually, you said I was in California. We drove over yesterday and we went through the Sierra Nevadas and of course got out to take photos. And the scent, it was amazing. You're just away from everything and you can just smell the trees and the pine and the cypress and you just think, I want to bottle this up. So that was sort of what they meant by, there's amazing mountain scents, or when you're by the sea, but it's not an oppressive smell of the sea. It's just a mild scent of salty air. These are healthy scents, and that's how they would identify pure air. So they knew if they were in those surroundings, the air was good for them and it was healthy. And then how it affects their health is, as I mentioned, through their senses. And we kind of have to ask, well, how did they understand their senses to work? And so this is where you go back to the philosophy, and there are many different theories about how the senses work. But one of the main one is, there are 2 basic ones. One's called intromission, and intromission is where you actually take it into your body. So there are a group of philosophers called atomists. They believe in tiny little atom type particles, which are invisible. But if you're looking at something, like at the moment, I'm looking at a water bottle, for example, the way the atomists would describe me as seeing this water bottle is that the atoms would basically the atoms come off of it and they hold their shape and they go directly into your eyes, and then that goes to your brain or something and you identify it. With sound atoms can go into your ear, so it goes directly into you, and smell up your nose, taste is in the tongue. Not so sure how actual touch works, but they're the ones they mainly say. But you're bringing this stuff into your body, actually bringing it into you. So if you smell something pleasant, goes into you, and then it affects your humoral balance. So they believe you had 4 humors in your body: yellow bile, black bile, phlegm, and blood. And if you were healthy, you had a nice balance of these. So bringing something pleasant into your body through smell or sound would help balance the humors and make you healthy. So it's actually bringing that stuff into you. And then I mentioned the other theory of extramission. It's a Platonic theory. Basically, it's the same idea, but for vision in particularly, apparently you shoot some kind of fire outside your eye. I don't know. I don't know entirely what they meant. He meant, or they meant. But you shoot this fire outside your eye. It mixes with sunlight. You focus on this water bottle again, and then that fire goes back into your eye. So both of them basically mean you're bringing this, whatever you're seeing, smelling, hearing, or tasting, it's going directly into you, and that's how it affects your body. So
okay, I was going to say as well, it's a direct connection, isn't it? It's almost like there's a sort of a tactile, or sort of a direct communication between your environment and you.
yes.
So that,
Yeah, so you're directly part of it. It's coming in and out,
yeah.
you're, yeah, so
Yeah, all sort of part of the universal thing. I remember doing Lucretius. Gosh, that was the news mentioning about that. I was like, oh yeah,
yeah,
the atoms. Yeah, we had
yeah.
lots of discussions with that. Yeah, gosh. So Robert Island, if you're listening, I do remember it. um, yeah, I mean, obviously the sort of in the contrast with like the sort of the clean air, you mentioned the fetid air and the miasmas, and these sort of unhealthy environments. I mean, maybe just in kind of in terms of contrast, could you explain maybe what they were like?
Yeah, sure. I mean, these are the fun bits, because they talk a lot more about them. They'll just say, oh, pure air. But when you hear about the fetid air, so basically, some unhealthy environments were marshy places. So marshes, slow-moving rivers, anything where the water was sort of stagnant. They often talk about letting off bad atoms as well, or mists. And then if you're breathing those in or seeing them, that's not healthy for you. They'll smell bad. So anything with very strong scents. So marshes they're always talking about, don't go near marshes. The military writers say don't build a fort near marshes. That's Vegetius. Vitruvius talks about it in his book on architecture. So what's interesting is Vitruvius writes in the 1st century, late 1st BC, early 1st AD, somewhere within that period. And he talks about building structures in healthy spaces away from the marshes. And Vegetius, is writing about 400 years later on military things, says the same exact thing. So these ideas carry on in different contexts. So the marshes, toilets, any sewer smells, they're bad. So they try to get those out of the cities when they could, but usually it's just beyond the city walls. So, it's just, but anyway, you just try to avoid places like that. Also, there's some sort of theories that certain types of workshops in Pompeii where fullers worked, so they're working with urine and feces sometimes. They were sort of concentrated in one area, so you keep the foul smells in one area. So there's some other things. Kitchen smells, smoky, too much smoke. I think it's Pliny. It's one of the writers talks about leaving the city, again, because it's so smoky in Rome, because people are cooking, and so he has to get away from that as well. So there's some bad smells, and again, where there's not a lot of air movement, where it's stagnant, or if it's too hot and sunny, that's not a good balance. You always want things in balance. And if it's too cold and wet, that's not good. So you have to constantly trying to find that nice temperate climate where, it might be I don't know, cold and smelly, but then you can change your environment and make it warm and, pleasant. And
Yeah. I find it really interesting, obviously, because I've interviewed contemporary workplace designers, interior designers and architects, and you know, I mean, we always talk about air quality actually, and sort of opening windows and creating this fresh air, and how obviously plants are really good. It's whole sort of one of the key aspects obviously of biophilic design, bringing plants in. One of the key things obviously cleaning air. But I mean, I'm just why I'm finding this incredibly fascinating, because this is obviously what the Romans were talking about, you know, 2,000 years ago, where we are now, isn't it? Yes, 2,000 years ago. And it's smell, isn't it? They were picking up on the fact that it was smell. I mean, they talk about what they don't want, basically. You know, they don't want this sort of stagnation, this stagnant sort of thing. I mean, when we're in an office, we get stuck in a place and it's all stagnant air. We don't realize, but actually, you know, there's a recognition that it's not good for you, you know, and it was like 2,000 years ago. I'm going to keep saying that was 2,000 years ago. You know, so I mean, I'm really pleased you come on, because anybody who's listening to this, who are in like workplace consultants, architects, interior designers, town planners, you know, anybody who's even like doing DIY in their home, open the windows. Just, you know, create some fresh air. Don't use crappy black paint and VOC stuff and things. But anyway, so I'm not gonna go on.
I mean, there's so much. The more you look, the more you find. I mean, in the ancient world, it's just everywhere. It's ubiquitous, whether just little passing sentences in the literature, or, you know, just when you mentioned opening windows, I thought of another comment. And again, I forget the writer offhand, but he just says, oh, there's disease in the city, so somebody came in and and they open the windows to let out the fetid air, you know, this diseased air in houses. So, you know.
Well, yeah, there you go. I mean, you know, there's a whole reason why we studied the ancient world, you know, at school and stuff years ago, and now we're not doing it. So what's that about? Anyway, let's not go on to politics. Anyway, so I mean, obviously, why was pure air important to them? I mean, obviously respiration and sort of obviously air quality and stuff, you know. I mean, but in what way did they make that connection between sort of pure air and health?
Okay. So as I mentioned with the senses, that's how they're bringing it in the body. So, and then as I said, their bodies, they believe, are made of those 4 elements: yellow bile, black bile, phlegm, and blood. And in order for you to be healthy, technically, you should have a good balance, but they're always in flux. And so if you're, let's just make this up. If you're a little sleepy and lethargic, then they might say, go and get some exercise to balance yourself out. Or if you are suffering from an illness, for example, say you have a high fever and you're very dry, they would say then you want something that cools you off and that's moist. So they would recommend cool, moist drinks, cool, moist foods like cucumbers or something, or moist fruits. And then they might also say, go down to the baths as well and, you know, take a bath, that'll moisten your body. And then it's always treating by opposites. But then they also write a lot about maintaining your health. So there are a lot of books on regimen, which include diet, exercise, you know, diet, exercise, as well as, you know, putting yourself in the right environment. It also includes your education level as well, you know, get educated. So it's all about body and mind. But getting yourself in the right environment is also very important. And so that's why we may see people have gardens in their houses, or if they couldn't have gardens, they're public gardens built in Roman cities, at least in the Mediterranean that we're aware of. And then there's more work being done on northern regions of the empire. So we do have evidence for some gardens as well. So the idea travels. But get away, you know, if you're in a bad environment, you can just get out, going to the baths was healthy, which you as a classicist will know that, you know, they're always talking about going to the baths, but also around these large public baths were gardens. And I'm working on a paper with a friend of mine on how this idea carries over into the Renaissance.
Oh, really?
His name is Dr. Giacomo Savani, and he works on Roman baths, and I do the gardens, and we found that there was this link, and it carries on into the 16th, 17th century. So yeah.
Wow. Really interesting, isn't it? It's just, you know, yeah, it really is. I mean, sort of talking about gardens, maybe we can just talk about now about why, you know, what were the sort of typical features of a garden, a Pompeian garden, you know, what elements were important to them?
Okay, first of all, you have to think about most houses have some kind of green space in Pompeii. Let's just talk about Pompeii and Herculaneum first, and then I'll come back and talk about Rome and Ostia. But basically what you do is you find, and they're all houses are different sizes, but even small houses have some kind of green space. But usually the typical garden is at the back of the house. So you're away from the front, which is on the street, and it's the furthest away from the street and the noise and the smells of the street, because Pompeiian and Herculean houses in Pompeii and Herculaneum were right up against the street for the most part. You know, this front door, tiny step, street. So it's, everything's very public and loud at the front. So the gardens are at the back, so you have the quiet. And then when you go into the gardens, they're usually surrounded by peripteros, so you know, there's a covered walkway, sometimes depending on the size, all the way around on 4 sides, or just 1 or 2 areas, but usually there's a covered space so you can sit in the shade when it's too hot. So again, getting that balance right. So usually a shaded space to sit. And then in the garden itself, you usually have flower beds, and there's a mix of different types of plants and trees. So for example, they had some citron trees, cypress, olive trees, sorry, and then grapevines, walnut trees, hazelnuts. So lots of different trees that you can eat, and they provide shade. Then there's different types of foods that we found evidence for. So chickpeas, fava beans, lentils, beetroot, cucumbers, leeks, cabbage, garlic, onion, and then beautifully scented bushes like rosemary, oleander, myrtle, and laurel trees. So there's evidence for these from charred fruit remains, charred roots, after Pompeii was covered with volcanic ash, and then also from the pollen samples from the soil. So I've just mentioned a few things, but they found lots of, so they're flowers, trees, bushes, all sorts of greenery in them. And then you also have a water element. Usually there's some type of fountain. These can be very elaborate, you know, shooting fountains with, you know, animals with, I think there's one of a frog where it has a fountain, you know, water shooting out of it, or sometimes you have waterfalls. They're in the really elaborate gardens, but then you just have small ones which have look like bird fountains, and there's little water shooting out. Sorry, they look like bird baths with water shooting out of the garden. So you have the water features, covered walkways, plants, and then sometimes you get little religious objects. I don't mention this really in the paper, but there's usually an altar or something for the family to worship in. Sometimes you get tables, so people were eating outside, you know, evidence for the dining couches. And then also sometimes you get murals on people's walls, fresco paintings and mosaics. So they're highly decorated, and but as I said, very but they do have them even in the smallest houses. Sometimes you have houses that don't actually have garden space, but they may have a little light well, and you'll see evidence of painting to make it look like there was a garden. And then a few pots that show they have plants and maybe a little water feature. So they're trying to bring this into their homes.
Yeah, and you said, you know, even in sort of cities or Ostia or, you know, or Rome, you have
Yeah.
like sort of mock virtual walls if you want as well.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. And then in big cities where if people couldn't have, if they were living in like apartment blocks, basically, they could go to public gardens, which were around theaters, baths. So there was always this, there, at least from the evidence we have, it looks like this was very common, you know, to try to get that green space somewhere in the city so people could have it if they couldn't have their own garden. So
I mean, they recognised the fact that it was important for the citizens, for their
yeah,
health, their
yeah,
well-being, and also
yeah,
to keep them happy. Because obviously we've got the whole bread and circuses malarkey, haven't we? You know, but it is,
yeah.
you know, you get happy, like say, happy wife, happy life. I think is, you know, happy citizens, happy city. I'm trying to think
Yeah.
of
I
a.
mean, I don't want to make it sound like a utopia because it wasn't, but because it's so, oh, it must have been so wonderful. But they did, there is evidence that they were trying, and you know.
Yeah, exactly. It's just sort of like, you know, in sort of terms of town planning, there was an like you say, there was an ambition to
Yes.
create these garden, these sort of public spaces for people as well. So I'm interested in the wall paintings, and I mean, as listeners will know as well, I mean, the Journal of Biophilic Design, we're actually published as well, and we actually create large scale virtual walls. So we do, like, you know, we print on acoustic panels, we do sort of like chemically cleaned, you know, walls and all that kind of stuff, but we know the benefit of virtual nature walls. particularly where the space I work in is healthcare and workplaces and homes as well. But you know, to be able, if you're in like just a place, you know, a closed environment like they were in the ancient world, say for instance in the city, and you don't have views, you've got these sort of virtual natures, and in your paper you discuss some of them, like you mentioned the waterfalls and the, you know, the paintings that are in there. You know, you've got sort of images of the ancient of the natural world. I mean, can you sort of maybe explain a little bit, maybe describe some of the images or the colorways that are used in there? I'm fascinated, so if you don't mind.
Okay, great. I think one of the most famous wall paintings is of Livia's villa at Prima Porta. Prima Porta was a villa, it means first gate, in Rome. It was supposedly owned by the Empress Livia. She's the first Roman empress, and she was married to Augustus. And he reigned from 31 BC to AD 14, so within that region. But in this villa that's identified as hers, there's this basement room, and all four sides are painted with the most lush, beautiful garden fresco painting. And you can see it in Rome. And you walk into the museum room, and it's mind-blowing and breathtaking at the same time, the detail. But what you have, and they're all quite similar, and there are a lot of different garden paintings, but just using this one, you sort of have a grassy area at the front, and then there's a fence. They have these little low fences that sort of designates the wild from the area you're in, and you can look out onto nature. And then you have various types of trees. So there's pomegranate, a citron, I think there's a strawberry tree, and then they have pine trees and cypress trees, and they're all in bloom at the same time. So it's, you know, the idea is it's just fecundity everywhere. And, you know, even though they may bloom and develop at different stages of the year, they're all seen in their ripest stages at the same time in this image. And then what you get also are all different types of flowers lower down, and they're all, you know, blooming at the same time as well. And there's amazing bird life. You always see bird life in these images of Roman garden paintings, from the smallest to the largest. And they talk about pleasant sounds as well, you know, and especially the nightingale. And you often see pictures of nightingales, but they're beautiful. I mean, they're very accurate, detailed paintings of birds, flowers, trees. And then the woman who really works on Roman gardens, Catherine Gleason, who's at Cornell, she noticed, by looking at it very closely, can also see that these are very carefully trimmed. You know, they're not let to grow wild, although it looks wild when you look at it. She says, if you look, you can see all the cut marks, all the pruning marks on it. So they're taking a lot of care to develop these gardens, and it actually shows up in their paintings. And a lot of paintings also show these little bird bath type fountains. So you'll have what looks like a modern bird bath, you know, a little bowl on a pedestal, and there's usually a little fountain shooting up out of that, and they usually have birds sitting on them. And the colors they use for the backgrounds tend to be bluey greens, so for the sky, or you get yellows, which I think is supposed to represent sunlight and bright light. And then, you know, lots of lush greens for the trees, and then bright colors for the flowers. So you get reds, purples, whites, yellows. They're just amazing.
Yeah. Real flamboyance of color, and as you say, fecundity, you know, this sort of real, you know, lush life, abundance, make you feel good, make you feel happy, make you feel like, yeah, you're surrounded by life, living things. Back to biophilia. You know, obviously the sort of my whole, you mentioned and you touched on before, and I mean, I could talk to you for ages. I mean, you know, we said, you know, it's definitely when you come over to the UK, or if I come over to America, drinks chat.
Definitely, yeah. You can tell we have a lot in common with this.
Absolutely. Yeah, you know, I mean, how did the ancient world see the sort of the whole multi-sensory approach sort of benefiting the health of people? I mean, you have sort of touched on it about sort of balance and stuff. I mean, sort of waterfalls and scents and stuff. I mean, you know, is there sort of, I mean, any sort of medical treaties, or is there any other kind of evidence that you could maybe just touch
I
on?
think just saying, well, the medical treatise I've mentioned where they do talk about this, but we see it in poetry as well. There's Roman poets, they said Horace, who's, talks about lying by, a brook and listening to the sound of the water gurgling and the birds singing, and they paint the poets paint these beautiful images of what it's like. You can imagine yourself just lying there listening to the breeze and the wind blowing through the trees and the birds singing and the bees buzzing. And they mention this. Virgil in his Georgics talks about this a lot. Then you get the agricultural works by people like Columella and Cato and Varro, who talk about, some of it's very practical. They say, if you're going to buy farmland, make sure it's in a healthy area. You need the sun, you need water. But then they sort of also say that this is good for you as well. And so with the way they describe a healthy landscape for farming is much like Greek and Roman writers talk about finding a healthy landscape for your body, so that you can see these interconnections that way. So the agronomist poems, I'm sure if I looked at plays or something, you'd probably see more. The historical writers, Pliny the Younger, I mentioned, he's just writing letters to his friends, and he's telling us, I've got to get out of the city. I love the smell of the mountains, or, this is what and he describes his villa very carefully, and how he can hear the sea from his Villa Laurentum. It's outside Rome. He said, you can hear the waves of the rolling sea. And it's just, so they're all, so that's another, just wide range of literature. Just looking at the paintings, which I described, the mosaics they have, again, lots of natural scenery in that, landscape mosaics, landscape paintings. And then, from an archaeological perspective, sometimes people, besides the gardens, which there has been a lot of archaeology on Roman gardens in Pompeii and Herculaneum, you see farming equipment just on farms and things like that. So we know that people are getting out. I mean, some of it's practical. They need to eat. So obviously they're growing food and things like that. But another thing I just thought of was they also in their religion, when you look at, I mentioned early on how the pre-Socratic philosophers were looking to try and explain the world, in terms of what it's made of. But they also see nature as divine. They never say that nature isn't divine. It's not like they're saying Zeus made it this way or Jupiter made it this way. They just see nature as divine. And they're in Greco-Roman religion, they're water nymphs and, these little semi-divine creatures that hang out on trees, and so everything, they see it as divine as well. So I think just looking at their religion, there is this sort of respect for nature. You don't want to get a water nymph angry, they might do something bad to you, or so you appease it. So I think there's so much more that we can look at, touching.
Absolutely. Yeah, I completely forgot about it. Yeah, because the water nymphs and stuff, isn't it? There's all these different elements, the sort of personification of the elements of water and air and Zephyr, the winds, and actually by keeping everything. I mean, if we'd have carried on with that, we wouldn't have had global warming, maybe.
They weren't perfect either. There's a lot of
yeah.
But we can learn that too, Okay.
Yeah, we take the good things. We take the good things. I could talk to you for like ages. But I have to wrap up. But the last question that I ask everybody, so people who are listening will know that I ask this sort of crazy magic question. Obviously, knowing what you know about the ancient world and sort of see the sort of biophilic design in the ancient world. Sort of what aspects of a sort of ancient world sort of biophilic design would you like to see in the modern world?
I think I would like to see more green spaces, because when I lived in the UK, every flat I had, it didn't have a balcony. I always had to go outside, and I just thought, I think that to me, that was always the most confining thing. Even if I had a nice flat, there was no balcony. And I just thought, why not even just a small balcony, just to get some greenery around? That's not just in the house, but you have a space that's outside, a little bit of space that's your, green, you can grow plants. So I think garden spaces for everybody is, I know I'm exaggerating, it's idealistic, but I just think if we could find more green spaces, Bill, as you know this because this is what you do, but just the whole idea of bringing the outdoors in and finding this nice balance between what's inside, what's outside, finding a quiet space that's pleasant, that's green, that has plants and nice sounds. Basically have all 4 elements, I think, is what I'm trying to say. You know, you want your earth, air, fire, and water surrounding you, and it's nice and natural and doesn't smell bad. You know, it's quiet. So yeah, I could go on for hours, but it's just, I think it's just finding a green space that's healthy, so everybody has a little bit of it, even if it's balconies. And you're talking about green, you know, biophilia in green spaces today. It would be, I think people would be happier and healthier if they had somewhere they could escape to. And,
Welcome to the Journal of Biophilic Design podcast.